Folks always say you can never truly trust a wild animal. That instinct always wins out in the end. But on a freezing night in Montana, a lonely widower named Elias made a choice that defied nature. He nursed a lethal predator back to health, unaware that he wasn't just saving a life, he was saving his own soul. It was a friendship that shouldn't exist, forged in silence and tested by the barrel of a gun. And just when he thought he had to say goodbye forever, the creature returned with a silent, heartbreaking gift on his doorstep that proved us all wrong. This is their story. The white silence of the Montana high country was a lie. Beneath the blanket of falling snow, the forest was screaming, "Run!" That was the only imperative firing through the synapses of the young bobcat. He was 8 months old, a creature of tawny gold and black spots, usually a phantom moving through the underbrush. But tonight, he was clumsy, he was heavy, he was bleeding. A jagged tear ran down his right hind quarter, the result of a miscalculated leap onto a shale ledge 3 days ago. Infection had set in, hot and throbbing against the biting cold, slowing his reflexes just enough to turn him from hunter into prey. Behind him, the wind carried the sharp, musky scent of death. A pack of coyotes, 4 of them, hungry and emboldened by the blizzard. They weren't barking. They were working in a coordinated, terrifying silence, closing the distance with the relentless stamina that his feline burst energy couldn't match. The bobcat scrambled up a ravine, his breath hitching in frosted clouds. Every step was a fresh agony. He needed high ground, a tree, a cave, anything. But the pines here were lodgepole, straight and slick with ice, offering no purchase for his dulling claws. He skidded, his injured leg buckling, and tumbled 10 feet down into a snowbank. A yip echoed from the ridge above. They had found his track. Panic, cold and primal, flooded his veins. He scrambled up, his ears flattened against his skull. Through the swirling whiteout, he saw a shape. Not a rock, not a tree. Angles, hard lines. The smell of wood smoke and treated lumber cut through the clean scent of pine. A human structure. Instinct screamed to turn away. Humans were loud, unpredictable, and carried thunder sticks. But the scent of the pack was stronger now, closer. The choice was binary. Certain death by tearing teeth, or probable death by human hand. He chose the unknown. Limping, belly low to the ground, the young cat dragged himself toward the dark, hulking shape of a woodshed, standing detached from a main cabin. He found a gap where a warped cedar plank had pulled away from the foundation. It was tight, agonizingly so. He squeezed through, the rough wood scraping his wound, and collapsed onto a pile of dry, split cordwood. Outside, the wind howled, erasing his scent, just as the shadows of the pack crested the hill. Inside, it was pitch black, smelling of gasoline, dry rot, and dust. He curled into a tight ball, shivering violently, listening to the blood pound in his ears, waiting for the end. 50 yards away, inside the main cabin, Elias Thorne sat in a silence that was louder than the storm. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was a metronome counting down the remaining minutes of a life that felt increasingly like a formality. Elias stared at the fireplace, watching a log turn from oak to ash. He hadn't added wood in 2 hours. The room was cooling, but he didn't feel it. Since Martha passed 6 months ago, the cold had settled inside him, deep in the marrow, where no fire could reach. At 72, Elias was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains outside. His hands were calloused maps of a life spent working timber and fixing engines. But now, those hands rested idly on the armrests of his leather chair, trembling slightly, not from age, but from a lack of purpose. He looked at the empty recliner next to him. A half-knitted scarf still sat in the basket beside it. He hadn't moved it. He couldn't. "Forecast says 2 feet by morning, Martha," he murmured to the empty room. His voice was gravelly, unused. "Good night for sleeping. Maybe I'll just sleep in." A sudden thump from outside broke his trance. Elias frowned. It wasn't the dull thud of snow sliding off the metal roof. This was hollow, wood striking wood. It came from the direction of the shed. He sat still, listening. Bears should be denned up. Raccoons were too light to make that sound. A looter? Out here, 10 miles from the nearest paved road? Unlikely, but desperation made people do foolish things. Elias pushed himself up, his knees popping. He walked to the gun rack by the door and took down the old Winchester .30-30. He didn't rack around. The action was loud, and he didn't want to announce himself just yet. He grabbed his heavy coat and the heavy-duty flashlight from the hook. Opening the front door was like opening an airlock into space. The wind tried to rip the heavy oak slab from his grip. Elias lowered his head, squinting against the stinging ice crystals, and stepped out onto the porch. The beam of his flashlight cut a chaotic cone through the driving snow. He crunched through the drifts, his boots finding the familiar path to the shed by muscle memory alone. The door to the shed was latched, the padlock hanging open as it always did. He paused. Had he heard something, or was his mind finally cracking under the weight of the silence? He gripped the cold steel of the latch. If it was a man, he'd offer him coffee before he ran him off. If it was a critter, well, he didn't have the heart for killing much these days, but he wouldn't let a badger tear up his generator wiring. Elias threw the door open and swept the light across the interior. The beam hit the stack of seasoned oak, then the generator, then the old workbench, then the corner. 2 orbs of incandescent, yellow, burned in the darkness. Elias froze. The flashlight beam steadied on the creature. It wasn't a badger. It was a cat, but not a house cat. It was bigger, muscular, with tufted ears and a short, bobbed tail. A bobcat. And it was backed into the corner, atop the woodpile, hissing with a sound like escaping steam. Reflex took over. Elias brought the stock of the Winchester to his shoulder, his thumb finding the hammer. "Easy," Elias whispered, his voice tight. "Easy now." The cat didn't retreat. It couldn't. It was trapped. But as Elias's eyes adjusted, he saw the trembling. He saw the dark, wet stain matting the fur on the animal's flank. He saw the way the cat favored its right leg, keeping no weight on it. But it was the eyes that stopped his finger. A wild animal usually looks at a human with one of 2 things: predatory assessment or mindless panic. This cat had fear, yes, but beneath the fear was a crushing, exhausted resignation. It was the look of a soldier who had run until his lungs burned, only to find himself at the edge of a cliff. It was a look Elias recognized. He saw it every morning in the bathroom mirror. "Just get it over with," the cat's eyes seemed to say. Outside, a high-pitched, chilling howl rose over the wind. Then another, the yipping chorus of coyotes, close, too close, just on the ridge line behind the house. The bobcat flinched. The growl died in its throat, replaced by a small, involuntary shiver. It pressed itself flatter against the wood, making itself small. It wasn't hiding from Elias anymore. It was hiding from the monsters outside. Elias lowered the rifle. He looked at the deadly, beautiful creature, then at the darkness outside where the pack waited. If he chased it out now, nature would take its course in minutes. It would be a massacre in the snow. "They're waiting for you, aren't they?" Elias said softly. The bobcat blinked, confused by the lack of thunder. Tio. Elias stood there for a long minute, the cold seeping into his bones, weighing the absurdity of the situation. He was a tired old man in a dying house, standing guard over a predator that could shred his arm if he got too close. Slowly, deliberately, Elias backed out of the doorway. He didn't take his eyes off the gold ones glowing in the corner. "Stay put," he muttered, more a command to himself than the cat. He pulled the shed door shut, latching it securely against the wind and against the coyotes. Elias stood in the storm for a moment, his hand resting on the rough wood of the door. For the first time in 6 months, he wasn't thinking about the empty chair or the silence in the cabin. He was thinking about the half-thawed venison steak sitting on his kitchen counter intended for his own dinner. He turned and trudged back toward the cabin. The wind was still biting, but the house didn't feel quite as empty as it had 10 minutes ago. There was another heart beating on this property tonight. It was wild, it was wounded, and it was hiding in his woodshed. He wasn't alone. The first offering was raw venison, thawed on the counter until it wept blood onto the porcelain plate. Elias moved with the deliberate slowness of a man defusing a bomb. He opened the shed door just wide enough to slide the plate across the oil-stained floorboards. In the corner, atop the cordwood, the darkness hissed. It was a low, hydraulic sound, full of teeth and warning. "I know," Elias rumbled, his voice rusty from disuse. "I ain't exactly the room service you ordered. Eat it anyway." He backed out and latched the door. He stood there for a moment, listening. For a long time, there was only the wind rattling the cedar shingles. Then a faint scrape, the wet slap of meat being dragged, the tear of sinew. Elias exhaled, a plume of white steam vanishing into the gray morning. Step 1. For the next week, the woodshed became the center of Elias Thorne's universe. The main cabin, once a mausoleum of memories, became merely a place to sleep. His life shifted to the 20 by 20 space that smelled of sawdust and gasoline. The routine was forged in silence. Morning, meat and fresh water. Evening, the same. Elias didn't just drop the food and leave anymore. He brought an old folding chair from the porch and set it up near the generator, about 10 feet from the woodpile. He brought a thermos of black coffee and a stack of old Field and Stream magazines from the 1990s. He would sit there for hours, reading articles about bass fishing and deer tracking aloud. He read in a low, droning monotone, a sound designed to bore a predator into submission. "Says here the best time for smallmouth is early dawn," Elias read, turning a yellowed page. He glanced over the rim of his glasses. On the woodpile, the Bobcat, Elias had started calling him Rusty in his head, though he never said it aloud yet, watched him. The cat's gold eyes were unblinking, the pupils vertical slits in the dim light. The infection in his leg was still angry, forcing him to lay on his side, his breath coming in shallow hitches. But he wasn't hissing anymore. He was observing. This was the pact. "You stay on your woodpile. I stay in my chair. You don't kill me. I feed you." It was during these long, cold afternoons that the healing began, not just for the leg, but for the air itself. The silence in the shed wasn't the lonely, suffocating silence of the empty house. It was a companionable silence. It was alive. The sensory details of their coexistence became amplified. The crack hiss of the wood stove Elias had fired up in the corner to keep the temperature above freezing. The rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch of Rusty grooming his good fur. The heavy, musk-tinged scent of wild animal mixing with the aroma of Elias's coffee. One evening, Elias fell asleep in the chair. His head lolled back, a snore rattling in his throat. He woke with a start as a log shifted in the stove. The shed was dim, illuminated only by the orange glow of the embers through the grate. Elias froze. Rusty had moved. The cat was no longer on the high ground of the woodpile. He had dragged himself down to the floorboards. He was lying near the stove, soaking in the radiant heat. He was only 5 feet from Elias's boots. Elias didn't move a muscle. He barely breathed. He watched the rise and fall of the cat's spotted flank. For the first time, the animal looked peaceful. The tension that held his muscles tight like coiled wire had slackened. "You're a tough son of a gun, aren't you?" Elias whispered. Rusty's ear twitched, swiveling toward the voice like a radar dish. One gold eye cracked open, lazy and unthreatened, then closed again. The bubble of their secret world was pierced on the 10th day. The sound of tires crunching on gravel shattered the morning stillness. Elias was in the kitchen, washing the blood off a cutting board, when he saw the white SUV with the county emblem rolling up his long driveway. Deputy Carter. Elias cursed softly. He dried his hands on a rag and stepped out onto the porch, just as Carter, a thick-set man in his 40s with a kind face but sharp eyes, stepped out of the cruiser. "Morning, Elias," Carter called out, adjusting his belt. "Roads are finally clear enough to get up here, just doing a welfare check. We haven't seen you at the general store in 2 weeks." "I'm fine, Jim," Elias said, leaning against the railing, trying to block the view of the shed behind him. "Just waiting out the freeze. Plenty of canned goods." Carter nodded, his eyes scanning the property. It was a cop's habit, looking for things that were out of place. "Glad to hear it. Listen, we got reports of that pack of coyotes moving this way, taking down livestock over at the Miller place. Big pack, aggressive." Elias felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. "Is that so?" "Yeah. If you see 'em, don't hesitate. Shoot on sight, and keep your trash locked up." Carter paused, sniffing the air. He frowned. "You got a generator running, or something smells like raw meat left out?" Elias's heart hammered a single hard thud against his ribs. He had left the scraps bucket near the shed door. "Deer carcass," Elias lied smoothly, though his palms were sweating. "Found a doe winter killed near the creek. Dragged her up to harvest the hide." Carter studied him for a second too long. Then the deputy smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Right, well, be careful, Elias. A lone man out here. Things can happen. I've been out here 40 years, Jim. I know how the woods work." "That you do." Carter tipped his hat. "Oh, and Elias, you look good. Better than last time I saw you. Like you got a reason to get up in the morning." Elias didn't answer. He watched the cruiser turn around and disappear down the tree-lined drive. As soon as the tail's lights vanished, he practically ran to the shed. That night, the war came to their doorstep. The moon was full, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Elias was in the cabin when he heard it. Not a howl, but a scream. It was the sound of a challenge. He grabbed the Winchester and the flashlight, abandoning his coat. He burst into the night. The coyotes had returned. They were smart. They hadn't barked. They had circled the shed, smelling the blood, smelling the weakness of the injured cat inside. There were 5 of them now, lean shapes weaving through the shadows, scratching at the wooden siding of the shed, testing the door. Inside, hell had broken loose. Elias could hear Rusty, a demonic yowl that sounded like a woman screaming, the sound of claws shredding wood, the thud of a body throwing itself against the walls in a panic. The smell of the predators had triggered a primal PTSD in the young cat. He was trapped in a box with monsters scratching to get in. "Hey, get out of here!" Elias racked the Winchester and fired a shot into the air. Crack! The sound slapped against the mountains, deafening in the cold air. The coyotes scattered instantly, dissolving into the tree line like smoke, but they didn't go far. Elias could feel them watching from the ridge. They knew there was meat in that shed. Elias reached the shed door. He could hear Rusty inside, panting rapidly, hyperventilating. The cat was slamming himself against the walls, trying to find a way out, terrified that the wooden box had become a coffin. "Rusty, stop it!" Elias shouted, banging his fist on the door. "I'm here. They're gone." Silence fell inside. Elias realized he couldn't leave. If he went back to the house, the coyotes would come back. They would dig. They would find a way. He looked at the heavy padlock. Then he looked at the freezing night. Elias marched back to the house, grabbed his sleeping bag, a heavy wool blanket, and his revolver. He returned to the shed, unlocked it, and slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of fear musk. Rusty was back on top of the highest wood stack, pressed into the corner, his eyes wide black saucers, hissing at the door. Elias didn't try to soothe him. He didn't try to approach. He simply dragged the old chair in front of the door, blocking it. He laid the sleeping bag on the floorboards right there, at the entrance, the guardian at the gate. He turned off the flashlight. "I ain't leaving," Elias said into the dark. "Go to sleep." He sat there in the dark, the revolver on his lap. An hour passed, then 2. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the bone-deep cold of the shed. Then a sound. Thump. Soft paws hitting the floor. Elias tensed. Was the cat attacking? Had the panic driven it mad? He listened to the soft rhythmic limp approaching him. It stopped. He could hear the animal breathing. It was right beside him. Slowly, Elias reached out and turned on the small battery lantern on the floor. The dim light flooded the space. Rusty wasn't attacking. He was shivering. The cold draft near the floor was brutal, and the fear had sapped his energy. He looked at Elias, then at the blocked door, then back at Elias. The message passed between them without words. "You stop the monsters." The Bobcat took a step closer. Then another. He didn't climb onto Elias's lap. He was still a wild thing, not a pet. But he curled up on the edge of Elias's thick wool sleeping bag, pressing his back against the heavy rubber sole of Elias's boot. He needed the heat. He needed the security. Elias looked down at the lethal predator sleeping against his foot. He felt a lump form in his throat, hard and aching. He reached down, his hand hovering over the tawny fur. He didn't touch. Not yet. That was a line he wouldn't cross. But as the wind howled outside and the coyotes sang their frustration to the moon, Elias Thorne closed his eyes and slept better than he had in 6 months. The pact was sealed. They were a pack of 2 now. February broke with a deceptive thaw. The snowpack, which had entombed the high country for weeks, began to recede, leaving behind a world of slush and mud. The air grew heavy, smelling of wet pine needles and waking earth. Inside the woodshed, the truce was fraying. Rusty was no longer the shivering, broken creature that had dragged itself out of the storm. The antibiotics and the steady diet of venison had done their work. His coat was sleek, the spots stark black against the tawny gold. The limp was gone, replaced by a fluid, coiled power that seemed too large for the 20-by-20 room. Elias felt the shift one Tuesday morning. He was filling the water bowl when Rusty, who usually watched from the woodpile, dropped down. He didn't land. He flowed. In a blur of motion, the cat wrapped his forelegs around Elias's calf. It was play, the way kittens wrestle, but Rusty was 20 pounds of muscle and instinct. Elias flinched as needle-sharp claws snagged the denim of his jeans. He pulled his leg back, stumbling. "Hey, quit it!" Elias snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Rusty let go instantly, bounding back to the top of the generator. He crouched there, tail twitching, eyes wide and dilated. He wasn't aggressive. He was bored. He was a predator designed to roam 10 miles a night, now confined to a box. He let out a chittering sound, staring at the window where a blue jay was taunting him from a branch. Elias rubbed his calf. The denim was torn. A thin line of red beaded on his skin. He looked at the blood, then at the cat. "You're getting too strong for this place, aren't you?" Elias murmured. The realization settled in his stomach like a stone. He had been prolonging this. Every day he kept Rusty was a day he stole from the wild, and a day he risked exactly this. He wasn't a rehabber. He was just a lonely old man playing Noah. That afternoon, the illusion of safety shattered completely. Elias was in the shed, repairing a busted latch on the window Rusty had been scratching at. He had the radio on low, tuned to the weather report. He didn't hear the vehicle until the heavy thump-thump of a car door closing echoed in the yard. Panic, cold and immediate, spiked in his chest. He hadn't heard the gravel crunch because of the radio. "Elias, you in there?" It was Deputy Carter again, but this time he wasn't alone. A sharp, deep bark cut through the air, a German shepherd, a K9 unit. Elias's blood ran cold. He looked at Rusty. The cat had frozen, ears pinned flat, lips drawn back in a silent snarl. The scent of the dog had hit him before the sound did. To a wild cat, a dog wasn't a pet. It was a wolf cousin, a killer. "Just a minute, Jim," Elias yelled, his voice cracking. He scrambled to cover Rusty with an old tarp, but the cat was already moving. Rusty shot up the shelving unit, knocking over a can of turpentine. Clang! The noise was deafening. "Elias? Everything okay?" Carter's voice was right outside the door now. The doorknob rattled. "Don't come in!" Elias shouted, rushing to brace his body against the door. "I've got paint fumes, spilled some chemicals." "Open the door, Elias." Carter's tone had changed. The friendly neighbor was gone. This was the law speaking. "We got a call. Mrs. Higgins down the road said she saw a bobcat limping near your property line a few weeks back, and now she says her barn cats are disappearing." "I haven't seen anything, Jim. Go check the woods. Open the door, or I'm going to have to assume you're in trouble." The dog barked again, scratching at the wood siding. That was the breaking point. Inside the shed, logic abandoned Rusty. The smell of the predator, the loud banging, the confinement, it was the coyote attack all over again. He didn't cower this time. He attacked the exit. Rusty launched himself not at the door, but at the window Elias had been fixing. The latch was loose. The impact of the 20-pound cat hit the glass and the frame with the force of a cannonball. Crash! Glass shattered. The old wooden frame gave way. Rusty tumbled out into the slushy yard, shaking off shards of glass, landing in a crouch. "Whoa!" Carter yelled, stumbling back, reaching for his holster. Time seemed to slow down for Elias. He threw the shed door open just in time to see the nightmare unfold. Rusty was in the yard, disoriented by the sudden light and space. 10 yards away, by the patrol car, Carter's K9, a massive male shepherd named Bruno tore the leash from the deputy's loose grip. Bruno was trained to take down felons, but instinct overrides training. He saw a cat. He charged. "No!" Elias screamed. It happened in a blur of violence. The dog closed the distance, jaws snapping. Rusty didn't run. A bobcat cornered doesn't run. He exploded upward. Rusty met the dog's charge with a primal ferocity that shocked both men. He landed on the shepherd's back, claws digging in, riding the bucking animal like a rodeo cowboy. The dog yelped, spinning in circles, snapping at the phantom, clinging to its neck. Fur flew, snarls and barks merged into a cacophony of violence. "Bruno! Aus!" Carter roared, fumbling for his sidearm. He raised the Glock. Elias didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just moved. He threw himself between the deputy and the fight, his arms spread wide. "Don't shoot!" Elias bellowed, his face twisted in desperation. "Don't you shoot him! Move, Elias! That thing is killing my dog!" "He's scared. He's just scared." On the ground, the scuffle ended as quickly as it began. Rusty, realizing he was outmatched by weight, used the dog's head as a springboard. He launched himself off the yelping shepherd, hit the hood of the patrol car, and scrambled up the massive oak tree that overshadowed the driveway. He didn't stop until he was 30 feet up, pressed against the trunk, his chest heaving, blood, his or the dog's, smeared on his muzzle. Silence crashed back down on the yard, broken only by the whines of the dog and the heavy breathing of the two men. Carter holstered his gun, his face flushed with adrenaline and anger. He grabbed Bruno's collar, checking the dog's neck. Scratches. Deep ones, but nothing life-threatening. He looked up at the tree, then at Elias. The look on the deputy's face was one of betrayal. "You've been keeping it," Carter said. "It wasn't a question. All this time, you lied to me, Elias." Elias stood in the mud, his hands shaking. He felt suddenly very old and very foolish. "He was dying, Jim. The coyotes. They tore him up. I couldn't just leave him." "It's a wild animal, Elias, not a stray kitten," Carter shouted, pointing a finger at the old man. "Look at what it just did. It's dangerous. It's a public safety hazard. If that had been a kid instead of a K9, he wouldn't hurt a person. He knows me." "He knows you're a food dispenser," Carter spat. He dragged the dog back to the cruiser and shoved him into the back seat. He turned back, his posture rigid. "I can't let this slide. You're harboring a dangerous predator without a permit. That's a violation of state law, Elias." Elias took a step forward, pleading. "He's healed. I was going to let him go. Just give me a little time." Carter stared at him for a long moment. He saw the desperation in the old man's eyes, the same look he'd seen at Martha's funeral. He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, frustrated breath. "You have 24 hours, Carter said, his voice low and hard. "I'm going to take Bruno to the vet. When I come back tomorrow at noon, that animal better be gone. If it's still here, or if I see it near anyone's property, I'm calling fish and game." "And they won't relocate it, Elias. They'll put it down." "Jim, 24 hours. That's it. Don't make me arrest you, Elias." Carter got into his SUV. He didn't wave. He reversed aggressively, gravel spraying, and sped off down the driveway. Elias stood alone in the yard. He looked up at the oak tree. High above, hidden in the gloom of the branches, two gold eyes peered down at him. There was no affection in them now, only vigilance. The bond of the shed was broken. The real world had crashed in. Elias walked to the base of the tree. He placed a hand on the rough bark. "You can come down now," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They're gone." But Rusty didn't come down. He stayed high in his fortress, licking a fresh cut on his paw. That night was the longest of Elias's life. He couldn't coax the cat back into the shed. Rusty eventually came down when darkness fell, but he refused to enter the building. He paced the perimeter of the yard, restless, agitated. He stopped at the edge of the woods, staring into the blackness of the trees, then looked back at the house where Elias sat on the porch. Elias watched him from the rocking chair, a mug of cold coffee in his hand. He realized then that his selfishness had almost cost Rusty his life. He had wanted to keep the cat because it filled the hole Martha had left. He had wanted to be needed, but love, real love, the kind Martha had taught him, wasn't about holding on. It was about doing what was right for the one you loved, even if it broke your heart. Rusty wasn't a pet. He wasn't a child. He was a king of the forest who had been forced to live like a pauper in a shed. "I'm sorry, buddy," Elias said to the shadows. A single tear tracked through the stubble on his cheek. "I tried to tame the wind. You can't do that." He stood up. His knees ached, but his resolve was iron. He wouldn't wait for Carter to come back with a cage or a gun. He would do this on his own terms. He went inside and grabbed the heavy leather welding gloves he used for the wood stove. He went to the fridge and took out the last of the prime venison steak, the best cut he had. He walked out into the yard. Rusty was near the woodpile, watching him. "Come on," Elias said softly, tossing a piece of meat into the back of his old pickup truck. "One last ride." Rusty hesitated. He sniffed the air. He looked at the open tailgate, then at Elias. The trust was damaged, but it wasn't gone. The smell of the meat was compelling. With a fluid, silent leap, Rusty jumped into the truck bed. Elias closed the tailgate with a definitive click. It sounded like the closing of a book. He didn't put Rusty in a cage. He trusted him to stay. He got into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered to life. They drove into the night, away from the house, away from the laws of men, heading deep into the heart of the Sapphire Mountains, where the snow was still deep and the air was pure. It was time to say goodbye. The old Ford pickup rattled over the washboard ruts of the logging road, its headlights cutting tunnels through the endless black of the Sapphire Mountains. Elias drove with both hands gripping the wheel, white-knuckled. In the rearview mirror, he could just make out the dark shape of the Bobcat in the bed of the truck. Rusty wasn't. Pacing. He was sitting haunches down against the cab window, facing forward, watching the road unwind. They had been driving for an hour, climbing past the snow line, past the reach of cell towers and deputy sheriffs. This was deep country, ghost country. Elias cleared his throat. The silence in the cab felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums. "Martha used to love this drive," he said aloud, his voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "We'd come up here for huckleberries in August. She said the air smelled like God's own garden up here." He glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, just a map and a pair of gloves. But for the first time in months, the emptiness didn't sting. It just was. The road ended at a turnaround on a high ridge overlooking the valley. Below, the clouds had broken, revealing a sea of moonlit pines stretching to the horizon. It was vast, cold, and indifferent. It was perfect. Elias killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute. He stepped out of the truck. The air here was thin and sharp, biting at the inside of his nose. He walked to the back of the truck and lowered the tailgate. It creaked loudly, a metal groan that echoed off the canyon walls. Rusty stood up. The cat moved to the edge of the open tailgate and stopped. He looked out at the wilderness, the scent of pine resin, the tracks of snowshoe hares, the distant call of an owl. It was a buffet of sensory data that his instincts had been screaming for. Then he turned his head. He looked at Elias. For a long moment, man and beast stood locked in a gaze under the pale moonlight. There was no fear in the cat's eyes anymore. There was recognition. Elias reached out a hand, stopping inches from the cat's muzzle. He didn't try to pet him. He just offered his scent one last time. Rusty leaned forward, stretching his neck. His cold, wet nose brushed against Elias's knuckles. A brief, dry sniff. Acknowledgement. "Go on," Elias whispered, his voice thick. "Go be a ghost." Rusty didn't hesitate. He turned and leaped from the tailgate, landing silently in the snow. He trotted toward the tree line, his paws wide and sure on the crust. At the edge of the shadow, he paused. He didn't look back. He simply vanished, melting into the darkness as if he had never existed. Elias stood there until his feet were numb and the cold had worked its way through his coat. He closed the tailgate. "Goodbye, son," he said. The drive back down the mountain was the loneliest journey of Elias Thorne's life. But as he pulled into his driveway, past the dark shed and the empty oak tree, he realized it was a different kind of loneliness. It wasn't the hollow, aching void of grief. It was the clean, quiet solitude of a job done right. The next 3 days were a blur of mundane restoration. Elias cleaned the shed. He swept up the fur, scrubbed the bloodstains from the floorboards, and fixed the broken window. He burned the old bedding in the backyard fire pit. He was erasing the evidence just as Carter had demanded, but he couldn't erase the habit. Every morning, he found himself looking toward the shed with a cup of coffee in hand, expecting to see yellow eyes watching him. The silence in the house returned, but the grandfather clock didn't sound like a countdown anymore. It just sounded like time passing. On the morning of the 4th day, the anniversary of the day he had proposed to Martha 50 years ago, Elias woke up early. The sun was just cresting the peaks, painting the snow in shades of violent pink and orange. He opened the front door to get the newspaper. He stopped dead. Lying on the welcome mat, perfectly centered, was a wild turkey. It was a hen, heavy and plump. Its neck had been broken cleanly, efficiently. There were no marks of a struggle, no messy tears. It hadn't been eaten. It had been delivered. Elias stared at the bird, his mind reeling. A coyote would have torn it apart. A mountain lion would have dragged it off. Only one creature would leave a kill untouched on a doorstep. In the wild, cats bring prey to their kittens to teach them to eat. They bring prey to the elders of the clouder who can no longer hunt. It is an act of caretaking. An act of family. Well, I'll be damned, Elias breathed. A movement at the edge of the woods caught his eye. Elias looked up. 200 yards away, on a granite outcrop that rose above the tree line, a silhouette sat motionless against the rising sun, the tufted ears, the broad shoulders. It was Rusty. He was too far away to see the eyes, but Elias felt them. The cat was sitting tall, watching the house, watching Elias find the gift. Elias slowly raised his hand in a wave. A salute. The silhouette dipped its head once, a deliberate nod, and then turned. With a fluid grace that belonged solely to the wild, the bobcat slipped over the ridge and was gone. Elias looked down at the turkey. He looked at the empty woods. A laugh bubbled up in his chest, a rusty, creaking sound that he hadn't heard in years. It grew until he was chuckling, standing on his porch in his bathrobe, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He wasn't a useless old man waiting to die. He was a member of the pack he had been provided for. They say you can't tame the wild, and maybe that's true, but if you sit still enough and if you listen hard enough, the wild might just decide to tame you. Elias never saw Rusty again, but every now and then, on the coldest nights of winter, he'd find tracks on his porch, and he knew. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.